Look at this. That's not a tank gun. That barrel started life as a weapon meant to sink ships, designed to launch depth charges at submarines hiding underwater. Germany took it, ripped it out of its naval context entirely, and bolted it onto the front of a Tiger tank. The result could level an entire building with a single shot. It was called the Sturmtiger, and it might be the strangest weapon Germany ever actually used in real combat. Before we get into how this thing was built, here's a taste of what's coming. Later in this video, we're going to look at the moment a single Sturmtiger round hit a building during the Warsaw Uprising, and what happened to the people inside literally defies what most tank rounds are capable of doing. It's one of the more unsettling and genuinely rare pieces of documented footage from this weapon's short combat history, and it explains exactly why this thing was so terrifying to face, even though barely 20 of them were ever built. But to understand why Germany built something this extreme, we have to start with the problem it was actually trying to solve. By 1943 and 1944, German forces were increasingly finding themselves fighting not in open fields where tanks and mobile warfare dominated, but in dense, rubble-choked cities, Stalingrad, and later cities across Eastern and Western Europe. Urban combat exposed a real weakness in Germany's existing arsenal. Standard tank guns, even powerful ones, were designed to punch through armor at range, not to demolish reinforced concrete buildings and fortified strongpoints at close quarters. A tank shell designed to penetrate another tank's armor tends to punch a relatively small hole and detonate inside or just past the target. Against a building full of entrenched infantry, defended by walls a meter thick, that kind of precise penetration is almost the opposite of what you actually need.
What you need is something that turns an entire room or an entire building into rubble in one hit.
Germany's engineers looked at existing weapons that already solved a similar problem in a completely different context. Naval depth charge launchers, designed to hurl an explosive charge a short distance and detonate with enough force to crack a submarine's hull even without a direct hit. If something like that could crack open a submarine's pressure hull underwater, the thinking went, it could certainly demolish a building above ground. The weapon they landed on was a massive 380mm rocket-propelled mortar, adapted directly from a naval depth charge launcher design. This wasn't a small tweak. It was a genuinely unusual repurposing of naval ordnance for a completely different battlefield role. To carry something this large, engineers needed the sturdiest, most heavily armored chassis already in production, the Tiger I tank. The Sturmtiger essentially took a Tiger's hull, stripped off its turret and standard gun, and replaced it with a fixed, heavily armored casemate housing this enormous mortar tube. The math here is almost absurd by tank standards. Each individual rocket round weighed around 345 kilograms, roughly the weight of a small car, and carried enough high explosive to demolish a multi-story building with a single direct hit. Because the weapon was rocket-propelled, rather than relying purely on a traditional gun barrel's propellant charge, it produced less recoil than you'd expect from something firing a shell that heavy, which is part of why it was even mechanically possible to fire from a vehicle at all. But that size came with an obvious trade-off. The vehicle could only carry somewhere between 12 and 14 rounds internally, because each shell took up an enormous amount of space.
This wasn't a weapon built for sustained firefights. It was built to deliver a small number of devastating hits, then either reload very slowly or retreat. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into quick summaries of this vehicle. Loading a Sturmtiger was a genuinely brutal physical task. Each 345-kilogram round had to be maneuvered into the breech using a small internal crane mounted inside the vehicle, since no crew member could simply lift and load something that heavy by hand, even with several people working together. This made reload times painfully slow, often several minutes between shots, compared to the seconds it takes to reload a standard tank gun. In a fast-moving firefight, this was a serious tactical liability. A Sturmtiger crew that fired its shot and then found itself facing quick counterfire before it could reload and fire again was in serious trouble.
This is part of why the Sturmtiger was never intended to operate like a normal tank, trading shots with enemy armor. It was built as a specialized siege weapon, something to be brought up cautiously. Fire a small number of devastating shots at fixed targets like buildings or bunkers, and then withdraw, rather than engage in prolonged direct combat. Now, back to that teaser from the start of the video. During the Warsaw Uprising in August and September 1944, German forces used Sturmtigers against Polish resistance fighters entrenched in city buildings. Exactly the kind of urban, fortified target this weapon was designed for. There are documented accounts describing a single Sturmtiger round striking an occupied building and effectively collapsing multiple floors in on themselves in one hit, with a blast radius and concussive force far beyond what a conventional tank shell could produce.
The psychological effect on defenders was reportedly severe. Soldiers who had grown used to surviving conventional tank and artillery fire found this weapon categorically different, since a single hit could destroy an entire fortified position rather than just damaging part of it. Some accounts from the period describe the weapon's effect on morale as being almost as significant as its physical destructive power, precisely because there was so little a defender could do to prepare for or survive a direct hit. This is also, frankly, where the story gets genuinely grim, rather than just technically fascinating. This was a weapon used against people defending their own city during an uprising against occupation, and its devastating effectiveness came at a real human cost that's worth acknowledging rather than glossing over in favor of just marveling at the engineering.
Despite its fearsome reputation, only around 18 to 20 Sturmtigers were ever built, a tiny production run even by the standards of Germany's other rare late-war vehicles. Several factors kept numbers this low. The Tiger chassis it was built on was already in short supply and desperately needed for its original role as a heavy tank. The naval-derived ammunition required specialized manufacturing separate from standard tank shell production, and by the time the vehicle entered service, Germany's overall industrial capacity was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing campaigns. This scarcity means most of what we know about the Sturmtiger in combat comes from a relatively small number of documented engagements, Warsaw, and later limited use during the fighting in the West, including around the Ardennes offensive in the winter of 1944 to 45.
It never became a common sight on any battlefield, which is part of why, even among people who follow World War II military history closely, it remains a comparatively obscure vehicle. A few facts worth knowing. It was originally meant for a different city entirely. Early planning discussions around this weapon category were tied to anticipated brutal urban combat in Stalingrad, though by the time actual Sturmtigers reached the front in meaningful numbers, that specific battle was long over. A reminder of how slowly even Germany's most urgent wartime engineering projects actually moved from concept to combat deployment. The ammunition had a bizarre secondary use. Because the naval-derived rocket rounds were originally designed to detonate underwater against submarine hulls, some variants of the ammunition were engineered with fuse settings that could, in specific circumstances, be adjusted for different detonation timing, a small technical footnote of just how directly this weapon's ancestry traced back to anti-submarine warfare rather than anything built for land combat. Crews reportedly disliked how exposed the loading process left them. Because reloading required opening a hatch and using the internal crane system, crews were more vulnerable during this process than in most other armored vehicles of the war, adding real tension to an already slow and cumbersome procedure while under potential enemy fire. A handful survive in museums today.
Given how few were built and how brutal the war's final year was for German heavy vehicles generally, It's somewhat remarkable that any Sturmtigers survived at all. A small number can still be seen in museum collections, giving visitors a chance to appreciate up close just how oversized and strange that mortar tube really looks mounted on a tank hull. Unlike the Maus, which never fired a shot in genuine combat, the Sturmtiger actually did what it was designed to do in the narrow circumstances it was designed for. When used against fixed, fortified urban targets, it was devastatingly effective, arguably even more effective per shot fired than almost any other weapon Germany fielded during the war. But its extreme specialization was also its core limitation. A weapon that requires a rare, heavily armored chassis, fires an enormous, slow-loading naval-derived round, and can only realistically be used in specific siege-style urban combat scenarios, was never going to be built in large numbers or reshape the broader war. It's a genuinely fascinating case of a weapon that succeeded tactically in its narrow role, while remaining almost entirely irrelevant to Germany's larger strategic situation by the time it saw combat. The Sturmtiger is a strange kind of success story, a weapon so specialized, so mechanically bizarre, and produced in such tiny numbers that it barely qualifies as a real production vehicle by the standards of anything else in this war. And yet, in the handful of moments it actually saw combat, it did exactly what it was built to do, with a level of destructive force that genuinely shocked the people on the receiving end of it. It's a reminder that a weapon's significance in history isn't always about how many were built, or how the war ultimately turned out. Sometimes, it's about a handful of documented moments in a handful of buildings, where something built from a submarine hunter's weapon proved just how strange and destructive late-war engineering could get. If you want to see the flip side of this story, the desperate, scraped-together weapons Germany built when it had almost nothing left to fight with, let me know in the comments.